I built the environmental compliance framework for Norwood Credit Union from the ground up. Every GHG emissions audit procedure, every climate-related financial disclosure protocol we filed with OSFI, every enhanced due diligence checklist for our commercial lending portfolio, I wrote them. Not adapted from a template, not outsourced to a consultant, written by me over 14 years, revised and stress-tested through 3 separate regulatory examinations, and one particularly brutal OSFI supervisory review that nearly cost us our Schedule I charter designation. I'm telling you this not to impress you. I'm telling you this because it matters to what happened next. My name is not important. What matters is that I was the Chief Compliance Officer at Norwood Credit Union, a mid-sized federally regulated credit union headquartered in Kitchener, Ontario, with branches in Guelph, Cambridge, and Waterloo. We weren't a big bank. We weren't flashy. But we were solid, the kind of institution that regional businesses trusted with their operating lines, and where retirees kept their savings because they knew we'd be there in 30 years. I'd been part of building that reputation. I'd helped protect it during periods when protecting it was genuinely difficult. And then, 11 months ago, the board brought in a new CEO. His name was Thorne. He came from a private equity background, specifically a Vancouver-based PE firm that had spent the last decade acquiring and restructuring mid-market logistics companies. He had good numbers, an impressive biography, and the kind of quiet confidence that reads as competence until you spend enough time with him to realize it's something else entirely. The board was excited. They talked about modernizing our growth strategy and unlocking the credit union's full commercial potential. What that actually meant, in practice, I would come to understand over the following 3 months. Thorne arrived in September. By October, he'd restructured the executive team. By November, he'd done something I'd never seen in 14 years in Canadian financial services regulation. He called me into his office on a Tuesday morning and told me he was creating a new role. Chief Risk and Compliance Officer. More responsibility, broader scope, reporting directly to the board. It sounded like a promotion. He slid a new organizational chart across the desk and waited. I looked at it for a moment before I understood what I was actually seeing. The Chief Risk and Compliance Officer role was not mine. My name wasn't on it. The name on it was his brother-in-law's. "We're going in a different direction for the CCO function," Thorne said. He used the phrase "going in a different direction" the way people do when they want to sound deliberate rather than arbitrary. Elias brings a fresh perspective. He's been in risk management at the holding company level. Which holding company? I asked. Meridian Capital West. I knew Meridian Capital West. It was Thorne's former employer, the PE firm. His brother-in-law had spent his career assessing operational risk and logistics acquisitions. He had never worked in a federally regulated financial institution. He had never filed an OSFI return. He had never sat across from a supervisory examiner and explained a gap in your AML transaction monitoring thresholds. I asked Thorne about his brother-in-law's experience with FinTrack reporting obligations. He told me Elias was a fast learner. I nodded. I said something polite and non-committal. I thanked him for letting me know. I walked back to my office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk for a very long time. I want to be honest about what I was feeling because it wasn't what you might expect. There was anger, yes. The particular kind of cold anger that comes from having something taken from you, not because you weren't good enough, but because someone in power decided the rules didn't apply to them. But underneath that, there was something else. A kind of stillness, because I already knew, sitting at that desk on that November afternoon, exactly how this was going to end. Not because I was going to do anything. I want to be very clear about that. I wasn't going to file a complaint. I wasn't going to call a journalist. I wasn't going to reach out to anyone at OSFI or FinTrack. What I knew, with the certainty that comes from 14 years of immersion in Canadian financial regulation, was that the institution itself was going to do it for me. The system was going to do it for me. All I had to do was leave. And so I did. I gave my notice in December. Thorne seemed surprised. I think he'd expected me to accept a lateral move, maybe a reduced role in the compliance department under Elias's oversight. When I told him I was leaving entirely, his expression flickered. Just briefly. He asked if I'd consider staying through the transition period to help onboard Elias. I told him I'd already committed to another opportunity. That was technically true. I'd started quiet conversations with 2 other institutions in November, and by December I had a written offer from a Schedule II bank in Toronto that valued what I actually brought to the table. I spent my last 2 weeks doing what any professional does. I documented everything. Transition binders, procedure summaries, regulatory calendar, pending examination schedule. I handed it all to Elias in a series of meetings that he sat through with the particular expression of someone who doesn't yet understand that they don't understand. At one of those meetings, I walked him through our enhanced due diligence procedures for commercial lending, specifically the climate-related financial risk disclosures we were required to file as part of OSFI's B15 guideline implementation. "So we need to get this filed by when?" he asked. "The next quarterly submission window opens in February," I said. "The documentation requirements are significant. We've been building the underlying data collection framework for about 18 months. He wrote something down. I noticed he wrote down the deadline. I wasn't sure he'd written down the part about the 18 months. On my last day, the executive assistant organized a small farewell gathering in the boardroom. People were kind. A few of my colleagues pulled me aside privately and said things with their eyes that they couldn't quite say out loud. I understood. I drove home on the 401 that evening and thought about what was coming. Not for them, for the institution. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction matters to me. I didn't want Norwood Credit Union to suffer. I had spent 14 years trying to make it stronger, but I also understood something that Thorne did not. A federally regulated credit union is not a logistics company. You cannot restructure your way around OSFI. You cannot hire someone's brother-in-law to manage your regulatory compliance posture and expect the examination team to find it acceptable. The regulations exist because the consequences of getting them wrong are real, not just for the institution, but for the depositors, the members, the communities the institution is supposed to serve. I started my new role in Toronto in January. I was busy, genuinely engaged, working on problems I found interesting. I didn't think about Norwood every day, but I thought about it sometimes, in the way you think about a building you helped construct when you wonder whether the foundation will hold. In March, I heard from a former colleague, someone still at Norwood, who called me not to gossip, but because they were worried. She told me that the B15 quarterly submission had been filed late, that OSFI had sent a preliminary inquiry, that Elias had responded to the inquiry in a way that raised additional questions rather than answering the original ones. I listened. I didn't say much. I told her to document everything she was witnessing, keep copies of what she was authorized to keep, and if she had specific concerns about regulatory violations she was aware of, she had options, including contacting OSFI directly through the appropriate channels. She asked me what I thought was going to happen. I told her I thought OSFI was going to conduct an examination. OSFI, the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, is Canada's federal banking regulator. They are not the kind of organization that sends a strongly worded letter and moves on. When OSFI identifies compliance gaps in a federally regulated institution, they examine. And when they examine everything. The examination began in April. I know the general timeline because my former colleague kept me loosely informed, and because some of what happened subsequently became part of the public regulatory record. I want to be careful here not to characterize things I don't know firsthand as though I witnessed them. What I know is this: OSFI's examination team identified significant gaps in Norwood's climate-related financial risk disclosure framework. The B15 implementation that I had spent the better part of 2 years building, the data collection architecture, the third-party verification procedures, the board-level sign-off protocols, had not been maintained with the required fidelity following my departure. There were procedural gaps, there were documentation inconsistencies, there were responses to examiner queries that reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what the regulation actually required. Separately, and this is the part that I think surprised even Thorne, OSFI's examination scope expanded. That's what happens when examiners find one substantive gap. They start looking at adjacent areas. What they found adjacent to the climate disclosure failures were weaknesses in the AML transaction monitoring program. Not egregious, not the kind of thing that makes headlines, but the kind of systemic procedural erosion that happens when the person responsible for maintaining a complex compliance infrastructure doesn't actually understand how the pieces fit together. At roughly the same time as the examination was deepening, Thorne was pursuing what had apparently been his primary strategic objective since his arrival: a commercial real estate lending expansion involving a partnership with a Calgary-based investment group. The deal was substantial. I later understood it was valued at somewhere in the range of $40 to $50 million in new commercial credit exposure. It would have represented a significant expansion of Norwood's balance sheet, and, presumably, the kind of growth story Thorne could take back to the board as validation of his approach. That deal did not close. When OSFI is conducting an active supervisory examination of a federally regulated institution, particularly one that has expanded in scope and identified multiple compliance concerns, the practical effect on major new business initiatives is significant. Approvals slow down. Internal sign-off requirements intensify. The examination team's presence creates a supervisory shadow that makes the institution's counterparties nervous. The Calgary group withdrew. I heard about it in June, through the same former colleague. She wasn't triumphant about it. She was worried about the institution, about the staff, about what happened next. Those were the right things to worry about. I thought about Thorne when I heard. I tried to imagine what it felt like to watch a significant deal collapse under the weight of regulatory problems you'd created by replacing your compliance officer with someone who had no idea what they were doing. I tried to think about it with some measure of compassion, because I genuinely believe that most people who do what Thorne did don't do it out of malice. They do it out of a kind of arrogance, the belief that institutional knowledge is essentially generic, that expertise is interchangeable, that the regulations are just paperwork and the person managing them is just an administrator. That belief is wrong. In federally regulated Canadian financial institutions, it is specifically demonstrably expensively wrong. The examination concluded in late summer. The results, as they were communicated to the institution's board, included a supervisory rating downgrade in the management component under OSFI's CAMALS framework. A downgrade in the management component triggers what OSFI calls enhanced supervisory attention, increased examination frequency, additional reporting requirements, and a formal remediation plan that the board must file and maintain. The period of enhanced supervisory attention was set at 18 months. Thorne resigned in August. The board accepted his resignation. They did not announce a search for a replacement using the same private equity network. They retained an executive search firm and specified that candidates must have direct experience in federally regulated financial institutions. I heard this from my former colleague, who called me when it happened. The board is asking around, she told me, about you, whether you'd consider coming back. I sat with that for a moment. I'm happy where I am, I said. And it was true. I'd built something good at my new role. I was engaged, valued, working in an environment where expertise was treated as expertise and not as a threat to be managed around. But I also told her something else because I thought it needed to be said. Tell them, and I mean this genuinely, the institution can recover from this. The framework I built is still there, even if it wasn't maintained. The procedures exist. The regulatory relationships are repairable. What they need now isn't me specifically. What they need is someone who actually understands what the job requires. And they need a board that understands the difference between that and whatever they thought they were getting. She was quiet for a moment. Do you ever regret leaving the way you did? She asked. Just walking out. Not fighting it. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered. When Thorne put his brother-in-law's name on that organizational chart, I had choices. I could have fought it through proper channels, raised concerns with the board, documented my objections formally, made noise. And there's a version of that path that makes sense, that has integrity to it, that I don't dismiss. Some people should fight. Some situations require it. But I knew something that made me choose differently. I knew that the system itself, OSFI, the regulatory framework, the hard-coded requirements of running a federally regulated Canadian financial institution, was not going to allow what Thorne was attempting to do to work. Not because of anything I did. Because of the architecture of accountability that Canadian financial regulation has built over decades, precisely to prevent exactly this kind of decision from being made without consequence. I didn't need to fight it. I needed to step out of the way and let it run. No, I told her. I don't regret it. There's something I've thought about a lot in the months since, and I want to share it because I think it applies to more than just my situation. We live in a country with some of the most rigorous financial regulation in the world. OSFI's supervisory framework, FinTrack's reporting requirements, the PCMLTFA obligations, the B15 climate disclosure guidelines, these aren't bureaucratic inconveniences. They are the institutional memory of every banking crisis, every failure, every moment when someone thought the rules were optional and found out they weren't. They exist because the people who designed them understood something fundamental: that the knowledge required to keep a financial institution compliant and sound is not generic, not decorative, and not replaceable on short notice without consequences. When someone like Thorne looks at someone like me and sees an administrator rather than a load-bearing wall, the error isn't personal. It's structural. He didn't understand what I actually did, which meant he couldn't understand what would happen when I left. OSFI understood. The examination team understood. The regulatory framework understood. And eventually the board understood. My former colleague called me again in October. She wanted to tell me that the new interim CCO they'd brought in, someone with 20 years of credit union compliance experience, had reviewed my transition documentation and told the board it was the most comprehensive set of handover materials she'd ever received. I thanked her for telling me. She said whoever built the original framework knew exactly what they were doing, my former colleague said. I told her I appreciated that. I drove home that evening on the Gardner, late enough that traffic had thinned, the lake flat and dark to the south. I thought about 14 years of work, the policy documents, the regulatory submissions, the late nights before examination cycles, the careful calibration of every procedure to match what the regulation actually required. I thought about the Tuesday morning when Thorne slid that organizational chart across the desk. I thought about how I'd smiled, thanked him, walked back to my office and started writing my resignation letter. And I thought about something a mentor told me early in my career, when I was still learning what compliance really meant. The institution bears the consequences, not the individual who made the decision. The regulatory framework doesn't care who gave the order. It cares whether the order was followed. When the answer is no, when the policy wasn't maintained, when the disclosure wasn't filed, when the examiner's question can't be answered, the institution bears the consequences. They know the difference, regulators do, between an institution that's genuinely trying and one that's been hollowed out by someone who thought expertise was negotiable. They always know the difference.